Hello again. Welcome to week 8 of Watercolours with Caroline. We've been painting all around the world and now we're back to my home province of British Columbia. We're going to be painting St Mary Lake in the Kootenays, photographed by Jill Brooks, and kindly she allowed me to use her photograph for this painting. So here we go. If you're taking my Zoom class, you have the drawing hopefully ready and we're going to get started. Step one is going to be the sky, as usual. It seems, I think most painters start with the sky. And we're also, after we do the sky, we're going to use the color to do the first layer of the river. The river has 3 layers of color. So we want the lightest one on first, the light sky reflection. And then when that's dry, we'll put some of the darker reflections on. So we're going to use mainly cerulean blue for the sky. You can add in a little bit of cobalt or ultramarine if you want to, but I think it's good to just stick with cerulean. It's such a lovely sky color. And a little bit more cloud maybe than we have been doing, because the sky is a big feature. Now, if you read my notes, I said that we've got the horizon, which is sort of here, right pretty much in the middle of the paper, which I know I've often told you is a no-no, but it's not a no-no for this one, because we have, like I wrote, we've got about a third of this painting is mountains, about a third of it is sky, and about a third of it is river. So we've got the thirds of composition, which are really important. So this little tiny bit of horizon line that's halfway up is not a big concern for this one. And we definitely need all of this space for the river, and we need all of this space for the sky. So it works out. Also, this mountain comes about 2/3 of the way across the paper, which is another really good design composition tool. And it just so happened, and I think that's why this photograph attracted me, it's perfectly composed, everything about it. Not only that, we have the S curves of the river, which are beautiful things to put in a composition, having an S curve. So everything about this photo was just perfect for our purpose. So let me find a brush to wet the sky. And I want to be very careful not to wet the snowy mountains in particular, because I want them to have nice, crisp, white edges. So the first thing I'm going to do is wet the sky carefully, and being really careful to not wet those lovely white snowy mountains back there. I'm going to keep the white paper. And they're right behind, we're going to paint them in behind the trees, and then the trees on the front of them. I have to kind of remember how I did that, because it's all a long, long time ago now. There, now it should be lovely and wet. Let me zoom in a little bit so you can. I think you can see pretty well for now. Maybe I'll zoom in. There we go. I think that's good. And you can see the sky. So cerulean blue. And remember, you've got wet skies, so your paint that you mix up doesn't need to be too wet, because if your sky's already wet, then your paint doesn't need to be too wet. And I'm going to use let me see what brush I'm going to use, number 6. I want a little bit of control with the sky, so I think my number 6 brush is a good one. I want to make sure that definitely at the top of the paper there's going to be some blue sky. So you don't want just white at the top of the paper, but remember, we want to have quite a bit of cloud. So go carefully, and remember, if your paper's good and wet, you can go slowly too. I want to have definitely a little bit next to the mountain, but we can have some white cloud next to the mountain, because the mountain's going to be dark. Now I'm going to get a Kleenex in my hand and my thirsty brush, clean brush. I just want to control a little bit of that cloud with my thirsty brush. Don't want it whooshing too much into the sky. There we go. A little bit more blue. And now the place you really, really want blue is up against those white mountain tops, because if you don't have the blue against the white, they won't be crisp and they won't stand out nicely. So you can go along that one like that, and then pop a little bit of blue sky in between these clouds. And anytime you feel that the blue's getting away from you a little bit, use your thirsty brush. I've got a Kleenex in this hand, and I'm just controlling it a little bit with my thirsty brush. Now I've got to make sure I come over here with some. And this is where you find out if you've wet your paper enough, because if you get to here and your paper's not wet, then you need to be wetting a little bit more when you start. It's not good to come in halfway through and wet halfway through, because then you get backruns into your already painted areas. I definitely want to go along those mountains before I'm like go in the center here. And again, I'm getting my thirsty brush, washing it, taking a little bit of the paint off, and just easing that paint around with my thirsty brush. This kind of making it less intense in some places, moving it into the clouds, picking up those shapes. Now, this is where if you want to get a little bit more intense color, I'm going to get a little bit of cobalt blue, just a little bit of cobalt blue, and I'm going to see if it's, I'll be careful because it may not be wet enough still. It may just be starting to dry. Maybe add a little bit of cobalt here and there, just for a bit of darkness, especially like towards the top of the sky is quite often darker. But I can tell mine is just starting to dry up. So got to be really, really careful. And I think that's enough. I can tell that the paint is not moving around. I can also tell down here that I didn't wet very well. So I'm going to take my slightly damp brush and do a little bit of agitating just to wet that area really gently. Here I've got a bit of a hard edge, and the same thing, I've just got a slightly wet brush. I'm just going to agitate really gently to get a soft top to that cloud. And this cobalt I put in is not blending too well. So again, just gently easing my brush around to get that to blend in. Take it slowly, make sure that you wet your sky well, and take it slowly so that you really get a lovely cloud pattern happening. If you don't get a lovely cloud pattern happening, you can do a second wetting when this is dry. Not now, but when it's dry, you can wet again and put in a little bit more sky if you need to. Now, on the river, just here, and I'll show you on the painting here, just here is very, very light. So we're going to wet that area, and on the photograph, I'm going to wet that before we paint the river. Just going to wet this area to try and keep this area white. Now, we don't have a reflection of the clouds in the river, but we do want to have some of the cloud, some of the sky color. So I'm going to my bigger number 8 brush. And this time I've only wet a tiny bit of the river. So I want a little bit more water with my wash, as I'm going to be working on dry paper. So I want to make sure that my paint this time is more wet. And so what I want is I'm adding a little bit more water. I want the paint to flow really well from my brush. And that's why I want a bigger brush. I'm adding a bit of water. Now, when I get up to that area that I've wet, I want to keep it white. So I'm just sort of going up to the edge of it when I get there and leaving it. Now, you have to work, if you're working on dry paper, you have to work kind of fast. You can't take your time. You've got to use a big brush and a bit of courage, and you've got to try and get that paint in fairly quickly. As you get into these little areas here, where it goes up to the edge of the river, up to the pebbles and the riverbank, lift up your brush, use the point, and poke the point of your brush in there. Back here is ice. So we want a clear line where we go up to the ice here. We're going to be painting a little bit of shadow on that ice at the very end, like at the end of the painting. And remember, here we want it to have white reflections. A little bit of blue near the snow. We're going to put more in later. That's okay, but don't lose that reflection there, the white. I'm just using the point of my brush to poke in there. So that's step one, putting in the lightest area of the river and your sky. And then that has to completely dry before we do the next step. So what I'm going to do while you're catching up is I'm going to dry mine with the hairdryer and let you catch up putting on your washes and so forth. So I will. So the next stage is going to be, we're going to do this big mountain in the background. And if you notice, it's more green towards the base, and that's because the trees grow down here, but up here where it's colder, they don't grow. So we've got sort of fading into a green tree line, and it's so far away in the photo that you don't see the individual trees. And we're not going to put in all of this detail. We're just going to put in a watercolor kind of fade. And ultramarine blue is your best color for these sorts of things. And to get the greeny color, we're going to add a little bit of azo yellow, and we're going to add a little bit at the top. And then as we come down the mountain, we're going to add a little bit more yellow so that we get that fade. And we're also going to add a little bit of burnt sienna because we want it to be a kind of a dull color. It's quite dark. And up here, you want to sort of skip over the paper with your brush so you've got that dry brush effect where you're letting some of the paper show through. So you've got a lot of things to work on here. And this I put on with white afterwards. I put a little bit of snow with the PH Mountains white after I'd finished. So let's look at mixing the color. Get my tray. And I want water to start with. And then a little bit of ultramarine blue. Now, I know I'm always saying like use the yellow first because your yellow gets dirty, but quite honestly, it's easier for me and probably you because I want blue for the mountain, but I want it just greened up a little bit with the yellow. So that's why I put the blue on first, because I want mainly blue. And then I'm going to take a little bit of yellow and of course wash my brush so I don't make my yellow dirty, and just get it so that the blue is a little bit green. We don't want dark green. We just want it a little bit green, especially for the top of the mountain. And then I want a little bit of burnt sienna because I don't want it quite such a bright blue. So it's not turning it into brown or green. It's just taking it down a little bit into a greeny, darker blue. That's all we're trying to do. And that's why I start with the blue, because I want blue, but I want it modified a little bit. And if I started with yellow, I'd have to add so much blue to modify it that I would have too much paint. Now, I want a big brush, a number 8 or a 10, and I want to dry off and get my rag. I want to dry off my brush a little bit because I want to have that scraped look where I can see the snow through. So I have to, and I'm starting sort of over here because there's going to be trees there, and you're not going to see this side as much. So I'm scraping sideways, coming down the mountain with my brush. And this is just the start of painting this mountain, getting the sort of the snow area on. And remember, you can use a bit of white later to add a bit if you lose it. And now I'm getting a little bit of water on my brush And here I want it to be more soft. I'm adding a little bit of water here to soften it. And then I need a bit of an edge to the mountain. So I don't want it too strong on the edge. So I've watered down my brush and I've watered down my mix. And I'm just very carefully, really carefully adding a bit of an edge to that mountain. So I have to go a little bit carefully with this. But if you don't have this edge here, it's not going to stand out against your sky. And remember, the snow is going in a downward motion, so you can keep going downward with your brush. As we reach the base of the mountain, like I said, it's going to be more green and it can be a darker blue. So we can have a little bit more blue on the brush as we come down. And I'm not going to worry about over here too much because I'm going to have trees over there. These trees blocking the view, and I don't need to worry about that side at all. So what I want to do now to get it a bit greener at the base of the mountain, I want to add a little bit more yellow to the mix and a little bit more burnt sienna to the mix. And I'm going to take a little bit more blue because I went a bit overboard with the yellow there. And so I've got a more greeny blue. And I don't want it too, I want to add some water to that because I don't want it too thick. This is in the distance. So I need it to be more watery than the close-up trees and things that I'm going to put on. And I have to try and blend it into what I already have. So I'm starting at the base and then I'm kind of going up into the blue area. And anytime your paint comes out too dark or too thick, just grab some water on your brush really quickly and water it down before you go too far. You really need to be able to see your paper through your color, because you can always put a second layer on later if you find it's dried too light or your color's not strong enough. You can put more on when this is dry. Now we're going to have trees back here. So what I want to do is bring this nice and straight across that horizon with the ice on the lake. As I come over where the trees are going to go, I'm going to put some water and just lightly take it into that water and leave some white space to put the trees on later when I'm ready, when this is dry. Now I have all that on. I can fiddle with this a little bit now. I can put some of those, there's sort of a bit of a line coming down, probably a valley coming down the mountain here. So I can put that on with some very gentle brush strokes. Remember, this is all going to be in your background. It's the main thing on your painting at the moment. So it's really standing out. But when it's all in the background, it's going to fade back. So anything that you're feeling is looking a bit too much at the moment, don't worry, it's going to fade back. Just putting those in. Now, I don't want to do too much. I can always come back when this is dry and add a little bit of extra shadow if I need to. So I really don't need to be fussing with it too much. While I have this color on my brush, I can do a little bit of color on the river. I'm going to a smaller brush though. I'm going to go to my number 4. And there's a little bit of reflection from the trees on the river in this same color. I'm going to wet the river just here, where we're going to put that green reflection. Get some of that color and just pull it across the river here. You don't want too much. It's just a little bit of reflection. I've maybe got mine a bit too wet even. I should have put the color on first and then the water. I'm going to have to go back and put a bit more color on when I put too much water on there. I have to wait and go back and do that when that's a bit dry. I'm going to do it on dry paper here because I want to sort of skip where there's ripples. I'm drying my brush, and just here by the land again are some reflections of the trees. So with a very dry brush and skipping over the paper, I'm just putting a little bit of green in here. And mainly I have green on my palette. It's a good time to do that. And I also want that mountain to dry a little bit. So I'm giving it a bit of drying time. This is dry here, so it's going to, again, skipping very gently on dry paper, just pulling my brush sideways to get a little bit of green reflection. And we're going to have a few other reflections. We're going to have some brown from the riverbank and a little bit more dark blue from the sky. And there's a little bit here too. So I'm going to pull a little bit out here. And then I think I'm going to wait and put a lot more of the green on later after I put a bit more of the dark blue on. And this has got to dry. Now what I'm waiting for is I want this edge to be pretty dry before I go in and do these mountains back here. And I think mine's drying up. We're just going to use ultramarine blue for the shadows on those mountains. And because it's white snow, you don't want a strong ultramarine blue. You want a really weak one. So a lot of water and very gently mix in a little bit of ultramarine. And you also have to be very careful to leave white on these mountains so that they read as snowy mountains. And I'm going in with a very small brush, well, number 4. You could use a number 2 even if you wanted. And very carefully putting in some shadow on these mountains, starting at the base and pulling upwards so that you don't want to go from the top down, because otherwise you're going to lose all of your snow. Remember, it's going to be more shaded at the base. Now we can come back and do a bit more shade when this layer is dry, but you don't want to go in full throttle. You don't want to go in too dark to start with. And small brush and really, really take your time. I have my number 4 in my hand. I'm going to switch to my number 2 brush. I want a little bit more control. There's quite a strong shadow over here, and your blue's going to look a lot darker when you first put it on, so don't panic. And the side of this mountain, I'm going to add a tiny bit of that green to my blue. The side of this mountain is quite shaded. Now don't worry about the trees that are going to come over the top of this. You can go down to where your horizon line would be, and the trees are going to go right over the top of that. Don't worry about it. It looks weird when you first put it on. You'll be worrying that it's looking a bit weird, but don't worry. I'm taking a little bit of more green shadow up there. And the ones in the background are even lighter. I'm going to use a little bit of the cerulean blue with the with the ultramarine now. So I'm a little tiny bit of cerulean blue with the ultramarine. And I'm putting in very, very light shadows for these mountains back here. And most of these are going to be behind the trees, so you're not going to see much of them. So I'm going to be very quick with those ones. I'm going to have big trees back there. Again, dry brush. I'm kind of scraping my dry brush over the surface to get that kind of rocky look. And again, they are in the background, so you're not going to pay much attention to them. The viewer's not going to pay much attention, so you don't have to worry too much about them. It's cleaning my brush up. You can see all my pencil lines here where my trees are going to go. So you'll just see the mountains poking out between the trees. Now, where I wet this too much, I'm going to go back in with those lines that I got too wet just now. Pop those in. Also right here, it's a little bit blurry and wet, and that's where I will come back and do a bit of a second layer when this is dry, just to sort of tidy up that line and darken it with a little bit of shading. So we don't have to worry too much about that right now. And then take a little bit more blue, add just a touch of rose with my blue to just make a kind of a violet-y blue. Bring my palette over and just added in a little touch of rose to my ultramarine. Just want to put a little bit of violet on the side of that mountain and in these deeper recesses there. Just a slightly darker color, blending that in with a wet brush. It may look too dark right now, but it's going to be pretty light in the landscape. Now, your river should be fairly dry, so you can work on the riverbank, because I'm pretty sure yours should be dry enough to do that. And for that, we're going to use raw sienna, and you can add a little bit of burnt sienna to it, or you can do them wet in wet. So let's look at my palette. So I'll make some raw sienna for the riverbank all by itself. And then I'll make some burnt sienna all by itself. And then I'm going to have a mix of the two. You know what I should do? I should get a bigger brush. I'm trying to use my teeny weeny number 2 to mix. That's not a good idea. There we go. I've got my number 8. Get better mixing. And then over here where I have my mountain color, I'm going to just add right into that some raw sienna and some burnt sienna together. And that blue will help. I'll take a little bit of ultramarine. And I'm just graying it up a bit more ultramarine. So I've got a kind of a gray brown, and even a bit more ultramarine. I want three sorts of colors for the rocks on the shore. A nice gray brown, a bright burnt sienna, and the raw sienna. Or if you don't have raw sienna, you can use a yellow ochre. That's fine. I'll take my number 4 brush, and on dry paper, completely dry paper, I'm going to start with my raw sienna, and looking at my reference photo, always, it's right in front of me. Yes, it's individual rocks on this bank, but we can put those in when we've got the main color in. What we want to look at is the snow doesn't come right up to the river's edge, and the rocks are kind of poking through it. So we need to follow, for the first layer of paint, we just need to follow the big shapes we can see where the rocks poke through the snow. We're going to work on individual detail after we get this in. So I've got rocks by the river, and then as we go away from the river, there's snow still laying on the riverbank. So and don't forget to leave little patches of white through your rocks where there is still snow. And here, in this bay here, there's just ice. There's a little row of rocks here, a few rocks here. We're just going to put ice in this little bay. And as you get further away from the river, the piles of rocks are smaller, there's more snow. So you just touch with the tip of your brush so that you have little rocks showing them. Back here are much browner rocks. We'll come back and do those with the darker mix. So along here, of course, the water keeps it warmer and melts some of the snow at the river's edge. So the rocks poke out and coming through the trail. And over here. And anywhere you see this color. Now I can see where this tree is. There's sort of this color there. So I'm just going to put a little bit of that in. So I have some sort of dry dead grass and stuff for the tree to grow out of. It doesn't have to be accurate. You can see I'm basically making puddles here. And I'm looking on the other side. You don't see many rocks on the other side. So we're going to leave that for a moment. I'm going to take a little bit of the gray brown, and I'm just going to come down this bank here with the color and then a wet brush and a little bit of blue maybe. I'm just going to put some shadow here because I want this bank to stand out from the one that's in more shadow. So I put a little bit of that gray brown and a little bit of cerulean blue just to make that riverbank stand out from the next one. Going to a much smaller brush, going to my little number 2 brush, and the darker mix, the one that has the blue in it, because I want to put a few of these darker rocks in. So back in this area, I'll get a little bit more paint in my brush. Back here are some bigger clumps of rock and dead grass and just shapes. And back here too, I want to contrast between the much lighter rocks in the foreground and some that are a bit darker back here. Also, there's some rocks, dark rocks in the river. There are people in the photo, but I'm not bothering to put them in. We're going to suggest it's too cold for people to be there. They look like they're wrapped up warm. Probably Jill and her brothers fishing. Just blending those in. And a little bit of dark. Got dark on my brush, so it's a little bit of dark around here. I don't know what it is, but it's kind of making that snowbank stand out over here. A little bit of that in. We've got to start, a little bit of a start on our rocks there. Now the same colors, I'm just looking for the right size brush, number 6. The same sort of colors, those browny gray colors, are here under these trees. So I want to get those in as well. I'm just going into that. I made that color that with the raw sienna and the burnt sienna and a little bit of ultramarine blue, and I'm going to even scrape a little bit of that green into it. A little bit more raw sienna. It's a sort of a browny color, and I want to put in the area here that's going to have trees growing from it. Again, you want to see some snow coming through that area. I actually just switched to a little bit of burnt sienna and a little bit of raw sienna on my brush because I want to have a few different colors in there. And back to that gray color for over here. So what I'm laying down first is the ground for the trees to grow out of, or the underbrush, or the areas where the trees are that don't have snow. I just want to pop that in, because the temptation is if you have trees just kind of growing out of the snow, it's sometimes people have trees sort of growing out of nothing. It looks a bit weird. Now I've got that same sort of browny green color on my brush, and I've dried my brush on my towel. I'm drying it, and I'm just kind of scraping it here because there is some really, really scrubby grass kind of coming out of the snow. I'm just sort of scraping with my almost dry brush just to indicate that. Yeah, just need blending that in. I need a couple more, I think a couple more little these lead into the picture. These rocks and the color on the side kind of lead you into the picture. Now, as that raw sienna starts to dry, then you're going to want to put on some of the burnt sienna and some of the darker brown so that you have the look of rocks. If you look at this one, when this was dry, I used the sort of the brown and the burnt sienna to make some rock shapes on there. Now let's think about what we can work on next. My mountains are dry back here, and we're working on this area. So I think this is a really good time to actually work on these trees and sort of finish this side of the painting a little bit. I think I want to start with this biggest tree right here, which is the lightest one. Bring this picture over. So this one here is quite big, and it's not light green, but it's the lightest green of all these trees. If you look at these ones, these are a sort of very wintry and don't have many needles or leaves on, so they're a very light gray color. These ones are a darker sort of brown because you can't really see them, they're inside here. But this one here is definitely the most green, but it's a very olive green. So let's look back at our mountain mix, which was, again, I'm starting with the blue because I want this to be mostly blue. And then I'm going to get a little bit of yellow, so you can use cadmium yellow, azo yellow, transparent yellow, and then burnt sienna, which is going to make it a more olive green. If you have olive green in your palette, you can use that. I just don't have olive green. I always just mix one. If you have one, you can use that. That's a good use of one if you've got it. I'm adding a little bit more blue, a little bit more yellow, and then some burnt sienna, like just get it the right colour before I start. And small brush, very small. The trees are very small, so I want to go to a number 2 brush. And I like to start at the top of the tree with the tip of my brush and put in the tip of the tree first. And then I just try and follow the shape that I can see. So this one is quite oval at the top, more oval than it's not a Douglas fir, which I'm used to seeing here. It's a bit different. So again, go slowly, small brush, and remember to have space between those branches. And this tree doesn't get too wide as it goes down. Or it could be a conglomeration of trees. I have no idea. There's too much in the way of greenery here. I'm leaving a place where I'm going to put the trunk. I'm actually going to get a little bit of raw sienna on my brush. And at the bottom of the tree here, I'm just going to put in a little bit of raw sienna so it goes wet in wet. As I come towards the bottom of the tree, I'm going to get a little bit of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna so that over this side of the tree, as I come down here, it's darker. And you literally, there may be other trees at the bottom here, you literally can't see the bottom of the tree or the trunk or anything at the bottom. You don't really know what's going on because there's just a mess of greenery here. So that's what you do, like a mess of greenery with your brush. And there's another tree just off to the side, not as tall, more of a fir tree. And this is just the edge of your picture. You don't want to leave a white space at the edge there. Even if you can't see, even if I've cut the tree off because I had to edit the picture, I'm going to put one in there. I've got a little bit of burnt sienna on my brush. I'm just making at the bottom here that kind of mess that's under the trees that you cannot distinguish what's going on. It's too far in the distance. Now, I know there's no trunk yet. I'll put that in later. I want to make a green that's more blue. So I'm going to, this is my green area. So I'm going to get a bit more ultramarine blue and a bit more yellow. A bit more blue this time. So I'm going to have a darker tree behind this one, sort of poking out behind it. And you can't, a bit more yellow. You can't see as much of this tree, and it's a different shape again. It's more of a traditional sort of tree shape as we imagine fir trees. There's some trees here. I want to add raw sienna to this mix. I want to have these trees looking wintry, but slightly different colors. I'm going to go behind these in a moment. I'm putting this one in here. And these I'm putting in fairly quickly because they're not that detailed in this little picture. And I've added some raw sienna to my mix to make it a little bit more olivey again. Now behind these more green trees are the more browny grey ones. So I'm going to wait till these green ones have dried a little bit before I put those in. But I have some over the other side that I can use this green for. Now over here, there's a very twiggy tree, right? Let's get my photo when I talk about a twiggy tree. I've got a very twiggy tree here and a very twiggy tree here. So for those, I would use burnt umber. I'll get my mixing tray. Or sepia, a little bit of ultramarine blue to get a little bit darker. And I might be getting way ahead of you. Let me pause. So I'm going to use my rigger with that brown mix that I made with ultramarine blue and sepia, or ultramarine blue and burnt umber. And I want to do two of those very bare trees. One is here. So let's start with, I've got a very thin brush. Let's start with the main trunk. And we don't have to be too precise. They're in the distance. So we just want to get a general shape. We've got a branch that are coming off here. And another branch that are coming off here. And those branches have a few branches coming off of them. You have to be very, very light touch. You could barely touch the paper with your paintbrush to make these really, really light lines. One thing I can do while I've got this color on my brush is I can put some tree trunks in here behind that tree, and there'll be some twiggy trees back there too, so I can put those in a minute. The other main twiggy tree is here. So get that one in. There's not many branches on them. And remember, the trunks are extremely thin. Like, I'm just using this very, very fine brush. The temptation is always to make the tree trunks too thick. And they're not thick. So keep them very, very thin. There's a fir, sort of a fir tree or some kind of tree here. But it's a light brown color and it has very few needles on. So I'm just going to use a thin brush that I have in my hand with the brown on to put that one in while I have that color. I'm just trying to see what other ones there are. Another one here that's really got very little happening, very few branches. And then I'm looking at this tree over here. Let's see what there is. There's one behind this one. Of course, you don't have to stick it exactly to the photo, but I always find it's just helpful to kind of figure out how things are and where things grow and what they look like. Now, of course, there's trees over here, but we want to do more to the river before we put those ones in. I want to get all these ones over here in first. And while we're doing that, everything that we did here, of course, is drying. So as we've got some dark brown and little brushes, we can also come back in here. And if we want to do some work on the rocks, those are other things that we can do. Now I've got the twiggy trees in. So I want to go back to my number 2 brush, my little tiny brush, and put some of the fir trees in. So there's a really nicely shaped fir tree here and a couple of little ones in front of it and a really nicely shaped one beside it. So let's get those in with, they're very blue-green. They're in the distance and they're a winter fir. So I'm using quite a lot of ultramarine blue with my green. And it's quite a solid looking tree. So there's one beside that twiggy tree, and then there's one just here. And really, you don't see the branches, you just see that sort of nice shape of the tree. There's another one that just here. You see a little bit more of the branches. As I come down to the bottom of the tree, I want it a little bit lighter. So I'm going into the more raw sienna-y, yellowy mix of green. And as I come to the bottom of the tree, I'm just changing color and putting a bit more of that raw sienna yellow mix in so that they mix wet in wet, and the tree beside it too. And then as I come to the base of the tree where I want a bit more shadow, I can switch back to a bit more of that dark green. And beside that tree and next to this one, a little bit taller, is another nicely shaped white green tree. And this is where your mountains kind of disappear behind your trees. And put in that one in. And if you've got some of that green on your brush, do a little bit of horizontal work too. Even though you've already got some ground for your trees to grow out of, it's nice to connect it with a little bit of horizontal work. The trees back here are smaller and a little bit darker, so I'm going to add a little bit of brown, a little bit of burnt sienna in with my green. So that when I go in here for these smaller trees with my still number 2 brush, they're a slightly different color. They're a little bit more browny green. I want to get, I'm going into a bit more greeny green as I go down to the base of the tree. I just got a bit more bluey green because there's a lot of shadow when you get down to the base here. And of course, they're fairly connected with lots of underbrush. Now, between that very twiggy tree we did here, there's a couple of other trees. There's a light gray kind of tree. So here's how I'm going to make a light gray for the tree. I've got that brown gray mix here. I'm going to get some cobalt blue. And I'm going to mix it with that browny gray mix here. And I've got a soft bluey gray. And there is a soft bluey gray tree just beside that twiggy tree that we did. Not very detailed. The reason I'm doing a few vertical strokes is there's a number of twiggy trees in that copse of trees, but you can't really see what's happening with them. So I'm just kind of indicating that they're there with a few vertical lines. And of course, at the bottom, there has to be some connection between them with some lines going into the the ground here. And there's still some snow showing through there. So, you don't have to connect them without white space. There is one more tree in here, which is quite a dark green one. So I've gone back to my darker green mix. And that's beside this tree. It's another very nicely shaped tree. And of course, as you get down towards the bottom, it's just a mass of green. In my brush. Now behind them, there's a little bit of the frozen lake showing. So I'm going to add a little bit of that horizon line behind them there before I go into the trees next to them. Come back to that raw sienna-ish gray kind of color. And maybe a bit more raw sienna. And there's a sort of a tree here. And you can see some branches and stuff going on. Pop those in. And again, that raw sienna-y color that doesn't have much green in it. It's more just a gray color. There's some trees in here. They will be, if you make them that sort of lovely blue, gray, raw sienna color, they'll just fade into the background behind these stronger trees that you did earlier. Now, there are a few lighter tree trunks showing, and if you wanted to do those later with some PH Martin's white, you can put in some lighter tree trunks that show. There is no way that you can leave them white with this smaller painting and brushes this size. I'm just putting a bit of a mass of, that kind of went a bit crazy. I want to put a mass of green at the bottom here where there's a lot of shadow. It's filling up some of that area. And then we're just about done for that mass of trees on this side, but we have a lot of work left to do on the rocks. I'm going into my burnt sienna, and I'm going to work on these rocks. Now, I think you're probably still working on your trees, and that's fine. You just keep working on your trees, and I will work on the rocks a little bit, and then I'll help you with the rocks. You don't need to be plowing ahead at my pace. And I'm going to pause just for a little bit to put the recording back on. So we're going to work on the rocks here. So we're going to use some burnt sienna and then some dark brown, and just indicating with some shadowing and some shape that there's lots of little rocks. You don't have to paint every little rock, but you do have to kind of, especially the ones near the shore, you have to kind of show. I'm going to zoom right in now, like really into my rocks here. I've got burnt sienna on my little number 2 brush, and I'm sort of just doing little like dome shapes, just kind of touching and indicating that there are individual rocks, but I'm not painting every individual one. That would be way too much work and too much realism. I don't want that amount of realism, but this just helps give them a little bit of texture. So we're kind of go along and do a little bit of that. And after the raw sienna, we can come back with some dark brown. I mean, burnt sienna, sorry, we're doing burnt sienna. you can come back with a bit of dark brown and you can add a bit more dark brown detail. But working on dry paper, it makes it easy to do little fine. You can just, for these ones in the distance here, you can just like do little dots. And these rocks go more out into your river. So your river should be perfectly dry by now. So you can actually go out into the blue river with your rocks and put a few in here. And remember, this part here was ice, but there are a few rocks just surrounding it. And this is another area where you can come back and work on it afterwards. You know, you do a certain amount now and see how it looks. And then when it's all dry and you're finished your painting, you can come back and think, what do I need? A few more dark shadows on my rocks. Remembering that we're going for a kind of an abstract look. We're not going for realism. So I think I've kind of reached the limit of my burnt sienna. So now I'm going to go into my really dark brown and to get it a nice dark brown, mix some ultramarine blue with it, with your raw burnt sienna or your burnt umber or your sepia. Mixing the ultramarine with it gets a really nice, deep, dark brown color. And now I'm going to put in some of those darker rocks, dark shadows. Not everywhere because you don't see them everywhere. But you definitely see some darker rocks, especially here when they come out into the river. Get more of that rocky look. Oh, and back here, there's quite a lot coming out here. I have that real dark brown on my brush. I'm going to add a little bit more shadow here and there. And again, resist the temptation to do too much. It's better to do too little and come back later. And you're looking really up close at mine now, but you know, when you pull back, and when you pull back from your own painting, that's when you see all these sort of things merge together and become groups of rocks rather than just little paint marks. There, that's going to be enough for me. Like I'm going to pull back so you can see it more how you would look at the whole picture. That wobbling is me cleaning my brush. I'll zoom in a little bit. Now we want to put some reflection for those rocks. And I know you may not be finished doing all your rock detail, but you can come back and do rock detail. But we need a bit of reflection from them. So I'm going to wet, particularly here, you can see in the photo quite a bit of reflection. I'm going to wet that area of the river and take the burnt sienna and raw sienna mix them together. Burnt sienna and raw sienna, and just pull some of that color into your river here. There's also some here, but I'm going to do this one dry because it's a tiny bit of river. So I'm going to put that on with a dry brush. A little bit here. A little bit more burnt sienna. Add a bit more burnt sienna here. Maybe there. The thing with doing this is you can make it darker and more intense later if you want more, but it's so hard to take it off if you put too much on. I'm lifting my brush up so I can use just the point. And of course, if it's on dry paper like here, I'm going to have to blend that in with my wet brush. I want a little bit more raw sienna on quite a dry brush, and just take a bit more here. See what I mean? You can just like build it up a tiny bit at a time until you get it. There's a tiniest bit. Oh, that's too much almost. I went on dry paper with a dry brush. It's just a tiny bit of warm reflection here. I just put that on with a dry brush, and I've taken a little bit off with a wet brush. Now, the river's still too light, so we're going to have to darken it up a little bit and let some of the light show through. So we want some ultramarine. My ultramarine over here. I'm mixing it with my cerulean that I had there. And a little bit of yellow. Mix it with the ultramarine so it's not so blue. And a lot of water on there. And then I'm going to work on dry paper because it's easier to control. And start at the snowbank. So we've got a nice dry edge here. And then bring our dark blue across the river. Remember, water has a horizontal wave pattern to it, or sparkle. So keep your brush going across that river horizontally. And remember, this part here is pretty light. So we can come up. I'm not wetting it. I'm just going to come up to it with my dry brush, gently pulling my dry brush up to that area and back to that area. So we have skipping over the watercolor paper. A bit more ultramarine. I want it a little stronger from this bank here. Just a little bit at a time. I want to keep the snowbank nice and crisp, and it will look darker if you're darker at that edge. Take a little bit of my green into that blue. Just taken a little bit of my tree green and mixed it into the ultramarine. And I want a little bit of that coming across as well. And just slowly work it up a little darker, especially on this side where you're coming from the snowbank. And remember to keep that horizontal pattern to the water. Now you'll reach a point where you can't really do much more. And if you want to go darker, you'll have to just wait till this is dry and have another glaze over the top of this. And I'm pretty sure I maybe did 3 glazes when I did my original, because sometimes you just get to a point where the paper won't hold any more water or paint, and you have to stop and wait till it's dry before doing the next bit. Like, I want to go a little bit darker in here, but it's too wet right now to go too much darker there. And again, the temptation is to go on and on putting your color on, but you just can't do that. The paper reaches the point where it won't absorb any more water, and the paint and water that you have on there is starting to dry. So if you put more paint on, you will just get what are called cauliflowers, where you get wet paper and dry paper fighting, and it doesn't look very nice. So time to stop and work on something else. Lots of things we can work on. Ultramarine blue. When you're doing snow, ultramarine blue is your best color to use. And the cerulean from the sky is a lovely one too, a lovely cool blue. So we have a corner here. You know how I hate corners that don't have something in them? I want to darken off that corner, and I'm taking a very light mix of cerulean blue. I'm going to drag my brush across there. That's not a bit too light, actually. There we go. Drag my brush across there with that cerulean blue. And added to that, I want a little bit of ultramarine blue in the corner. And that's just going to form some shadows in the corner there, some shadows on the snow. But I don't want it to go up to the edge. I don't want it to go up to the edge of the white. I can even pull a bit back with my thirsty brush. I want that to have a nice white edge, but I want to have that corner stoppered with a little bit of ultramarine, a little bit of cerulean. Also, under these trees here, if you look at the photo, it's a blue kind of shaded color under there. And the same thing, you can use your cerulean and your ultramarine mix, very, very watery, before we put all the trees in there. And you can shade that with a little bit of cerulean and ultramarine. And go to a much, much smaller brush, because the other place you want just cerulean, not ultramarine, is on the ice back here. I'm going to start by the back of the trees, and I'm just going to pull forwards a little bit and then lift my brush so I have a little bit of blue shading back there. And on the ice here. The snow over here, it must all be in sunshine. There's very little shade on the snow over there. The ice back here is pretty white, but it has just a little bit of shading on it. A tiny bit, so just put that in. We want all that in before we do these trees here. So I'm going to pause again. So mine's perfectly dry now, because we're going to work on these big trees here. And I have taken a little bit of artistic license with them to add this sort of yellowy sunburst, because I felt it just needed something warm and bright to pick it up a little bit. And you can see it's a little bit lighter here. But the way we're going to do this is we're going to mix up a very, very yellowy green, like lots of yellow, and a darker green with the same colors we've been using. We're going to start at the top of the tree with the yellowy green, and then we're going to quickly add in the dark green until we get down to here. And when we're going to put in big big branches of yellowy green and then switch back to the dark green again, and they'll work wet in wet together. And then when we put in the tree at the side here, it will also blend wet in wet. Now, I always put the tree trunks in afterwards, sort of in between the branches. Otherwise, they tend to stick out as not being inside the tree. And then we can put on all these extra little trees when we're finished, and a few dark brown branches and so forth. So first of all, mix up. Let's get my mixing tray. I've got a real mess here. I can use this one here for mixing the dark green. I will start with the yellow this time. She's miles away from me, so I have to reach a long way. So I'm going to start with the yellow, and then I will add the ultramarine blue. And I want to have enough that I can do those two trees, and a little bit of burnt sienna to darken that up to get it a good dark winter green. You can also use Prussian blue. I've got some Prussian here. I've got to get a better makeup Prussian. This one is, I think it's a Winsor Newton, but it's really dry and cakey. I've got a lovely dark green there. I'm going to put a bit of Prussian in there if I can get some to dissolve on my brush. The Prussian is a cool blue, so it gives it that real fir needle look. They're very cool blue trees. I also want a very, very yellowy green. So I'm going to get my other palette. Yeah, I've got a warm palette and a cool palette. So let's turn this around and put the yellow down. And I just want to add a little bit of ultramarine to that. Just a tiny bit. So we want it mostly yellow. I can even add, if you have a gamboge, which is it's an orangey yellow, this one here. I'm going to add a little bit of gamboge to that to warm it up even more. If you don't have gamboge, you can use any kind of yellow that's more orangey, or I don't know if an orange. You can add some just red to it, maybe. Try a little bit of red to that. Yeah, that will orange it up just a little bit because we want it quite bright where the sun comes through. Right, so the yellowy green for the top of the tree, and it goes way up. It goes way up out of the photo, but I'm just going to have the top just right up here. And I'm going to put that yellowy green on at the top. And I usually do a pencil line, so it helps me stay straight and in line. Now I'm going to switch with that little number 2 brush. I'm switching to the dark green mix. And I'm just going to let that blend wet in wet to that light yellowy mix. It'll just give a tinge to the branches. And you're working on dry paper, so you can work slowly. Take your time. And what I usually do with the tree trunk at the top is just come down in the same color at the top, because it all looks like one color. And then switch back to the orangey yellow mix, because even in the photo, although there's not much sunlight showing, it is on this side of the tree where it's lighter. I'm going to put some of that orangey yellow mix in on this side. And then switch back to the darker mix. And as you come down the tree, the left side is a little bit more branchy, and the right side less so. The branches tend to have a bit more space between them as they come down this side. Like I say, take your time. If you have the photo or something to look at it, because it really helps you with the the shapes and the width of the tree branches. And of course, as you get down to here, there's lots of other trees in there too. I'm going to go back to the orangey mix because I want that big burst of sunlight. So we're going to have a lot of the orangey mix in here. And it's okay, it looks weird right now, but it's okay because we're going to come in with the dark green and go up against all of that. Make sure that your yellowy orange mix is wet enough that you're going to get wet, wet and wet happening. Because you want to come in with your dark green and have it just blend wet and wet. These lower branches are coming quite a ways out as they come down the tree. Want a bit more through here and on this side. Now, because I want it to blend into the yellow on this side too, I have to get some of this one in. And there's some behind here as well I can pop in. Remember that there's not just these two trees, there's these other trees behind that you can put in as you go, because you've got a mass of tree branches as you come down here that are so indistinguishable from each other that you can't tell where one tree ends and where the other tree starts. So I've got to switch to a bigger brush now. I'm going to switch to my number 8 brush so that I have I can make bigger brush strokes here as the branches are getting quite thick. Now, the thing to remember is be careful that you don't lose all of your yellow. Don't put too much green over the top. You want some of it showing. And I have another tree I've got to get in. Now, if I see, I'm going to stop and come back to this. I haven't finished with it yet, but don't stop on an unnatural line. I'm going to stop with tree branches and come back to it. But if I stop with a straight line, I'm going to have a straight line if it dries, and it's going to look odd. But I want to get some of these other trees in before I finish these off. There's some like trees back here. And then there's a tree way back here that's much, much smaller and a bit bluer because it's in the distance, less, you can see less of it. I'll put a little bit of that yellowy color in there. And then behind all these trees are more trees that you just can't see. So I'm going to indicate those with some dark, much darker green going on here. I remember I did all that green from reflections. Well, I want a bit more stronger green now. Now that I'm a bit bolder with my trees and I've got an idea of what color I want here. Because the bolder you go with your darks, the whiter your whites will look. I'm putting all those sorts of things in, a little bit here. I know we've got this white spot here, but we've also got this dark spot up against the snow. Easy does it. A little bit of green in the river. A little bit of green in the river. That gives a little bit of reflection from those trees. Now, we have a lot of tree trunks coming up here and stuff going on that I don't want to finish these trees until I have some of that stuff that's going on that is very difficult to figure out, because it's just sort of a mass of tree trunks and fallen trees and sort of deadish trees. So we've got to kind of indicate those things there. I know there's quite a few like tree trunks like this. Some coming down the bank. Don't know what some of this stuff is. Have some of these tree trunks through here and through here. And this, I'm using some burnt sienna with a little bit of ultramarine blue. Some very skinny trees here, a couple here. Now, what I'm trying to do is just trying to figure out what all these lines are, all these tree trunks. And as long as I kind of have this sort of pattern in that's happening here with this mess of tree trunks, I don't need to have really clear ideas of what all this is. I just need to follow the pattern that I see here. There's probably rocks or riverbank or something here that's quite dark. I'm just going to use that brown color. I'm just using a wet brush to blend it in. I could mix a whole bunch of different browns and grays, but really, I don't think it's necessary. At the top of one of these little trees is sort of, I think, some dead branches, and I've got a raw sienna mix to start with those sort of dead branches. And then I'm going to add a little bit of burnt sienna mix on the left. The more confusing you make your lines, the more you'll confuse the person looking at it, and they won't be, they won't be saying, oh, you did that wrong, or that doesn't look weird. It just look like this confusing mass that we got here. I'm taking a little bit of shadow down the snowbank. I'm going back to this dark green because I'm just looking at the photo right in front of me, because we need to have some sort of more dark green happening down here, sort of in this area. Mix a bit of ultramarine blue with that, because in here, very confusing. It's just a mass of greenery. And for now, before I overdo all that, I can come back to it. I'm just going to leave that for a minute, because I'm going to put these trees in right here. I'm going to mix the brown and the green together and put these in. This one's quite tall. It comes all the way up to the ice here. And it has extremely thin bare branches on it. So I'm going to switch to my rigger brush. and get some of that browny color on it. My rigger brush is really thin. I'm just going to lightly pop those bare branches on there. They're very spindly, they're quite far apart. Very difficult to see. And they kind of have that upward curve that I'm giving them. Towards the base, because I've got like the tree trunk is darker than the branches. It's going into that darker color just to connect the two so they don't look too like they're unrelated. Now down here is a much smaller tree that seems to have a bit more greenery on it. So I've used that greeny brown mix for that one. It's still very spindly. I think there's a couple in front of it. And I'm going back to the browny green mix. There's another very, very thin, spindly one here. White bare branches on. Looking closely at. All I do is I just look at the photograph the whole time, like what does it look like? Trying to see what I've got it right here. It looks very confusing. But I think there's a bit more of a tree, you know, a bit greenery, a bit more green fir needles on. Brown on my rigger brush. And there's quite a lot of just tree trunky things. And I think there's another very sparse little fir tree here. Now I really think there's enough there to confuse the eye enough that it's doing the job of my little tiny brush, because it's easy to skip over the dry paper with the small brush. Get some burnt sienna on it. My river's nice and dry now. And I just want to put a bit more burnt sienna reflection. I've been using this very thin rigger brush, and over here too. Just scraping that rigger brush side to side, putting a bit more reflection. There's quite a dark rock here. Reflect that. This is kind of the refining stage now. You're looking at it thinking, where can I add a little bit more detail to sort of finish off the picture? We're really like, there's not a lot left to do. In the photograph, there was a big log across here, and I just thought that just did nothing for the composition and be very hard to paint. So I've just left that as a completely blank snowbank, which I think is much easier to deal with. I kind of feel that I would like a little bit more shadow on my mountain, but I don't know. Sometimes you can really mess up if you go back and do something. I also kind of feel like maybe I'd like a little bit more ultramarine blue in my river. And again, you have to be really careful not to overdo things like that. I'm going on dry paper with a big brush and skipping over the dry paper, taking a little bit more ultramarine. It's pure ultramarine, it's not mixed with anything. Bluing up my river a little bit. You know what, I shouldn't have done that over the top of those trees that I just did. That's okay, I'll come back in and go over the trees a bit in a minute. Don't go over the top of your wet trees just like I did. But I just feel like I want a little bit more blue. Even that white patch is maybe a little bit too big. It looks a lot bluer on my camera than it does on my painting. A bit more blue in the shadow here. It's even down here. That can hide a lot of sins too under your trees where you're not sure what's going on. You can just put some blue shadow in there and it really helps. Where's my... Yeah, right here where I put in a bit more blue looks much, much darker on my camera than it does in real life. So beware, don't go too dark. Anyway, I'm looking at what we've got and the time. I think we're just about finished. You might want to use some dark brown, and you might want to intermittently throughout this tree put in a bit of tree trunk just here and there, and behind it you can put in a few more tree trunks to indicate more trees back there. You can't really see the bottom of that tree in the photograph. There are a few back here. If I was going to darken this up, I'd have to do it very, very carefully. I don't know how yours has turned out, whether you feel yours is dark enough or not. But if I wanted to, I will show you how I would darken that up. I do think mine's a little bit light, so I'm mixing my ultramarine blue with my green that I made. And I want to start at the bottom where I want it darker at the bottom. And then gently with my brush sort of drying up from that, I'm going to push that color up the mountain. What I don't like is this, actually in the photograph, there's kind of a clump here that sticks out with kind of trees on. And I did put that lump there and then I didn't really get the shape of it. So I think I want to emphasize that a little bit. And emphasize this edge a little bit more. And then here, a bit more blue with the green. And it's okay to come up to sort of like bare patches, because actually what's happening in the photo is that up here in the snow, you can kind of see those trees, like really tiny, you know, look, it's a big mountain. So they're extremely tiny dots, but there are lots and lots of tiny, tiny trees. So you can sort of use the point of your brush and poke those up a little bit. So you don't, what I'm sort of trying to say is you don't have to have a perfect finish to this Doesn't have to be flat. And there's a thing, there's some trees down here. Let's see that kind of pokes up a bit too. Giving a bit more shape to the mountain. Yeah, I think I'm a bit happier with that now. I think it was a little bit too light. And of course, if you've lost your snow, if you've lost all of your lights, then that's what the PH Martin's white is so great at. Got a little bit of this, and again, a dry brush. I haven't really lost my lights, but I'm just going to demonstrate it. I'm using it with a sort of a dry brush, not too wet. And you can drag that if you want to get a little bit more snow. You can sort of drag that down your mountain to put a bit more snow in. You know, down here, there's very intermittent snow. So I can put a bit extra in if I need to. If you've lost any lights in your river, same thing, you can drag your white across the river. If you've lost some on your mountains, you can use your white on your mountains. It's your, oh, the other place I was talking about too was over here. There are a few quite light tree trunks. And it's kind of nice to put a few of those in. And again, do not overdo this, as I can only see 3 or 4. But just putting a few of those light tree trunks in kind of breaks up that big green mass and helps with that. And anywhere else you've lost, you know, you've lost a bit of white, or your horizon's not that great, or if you've lost your white here, just get that white out. You can tidy up your riverbank if you need to. Put some ripples in your water. Lovely. You can go absolutely wild with it. So you have to stop before you do. Anyway, let's zoom out a bit because it's a bit too close to see the whole picture. And I'm pretty sure that's us. That's all done for that one. And I'll send the best one as a thank you to Jill, because of course I'll be doing another one tomorrow in class. That's our last one, and I'm so sorry it's our last one, but I have to get some more photographs for the fall. If any of you have any great photographs, please just email them to me, because it's a really big help if you have something beautiful to paint. Well, thank you for joining me again for that painting session. This has been so much fun. And now I'm going to take a little bit of a break for the summer. I have a show coming up and I want to get out in my kayak in the sunshine and on the water. So have a great summer, everyone, and I'll see you again in the fall. Bye now.